In the harsh winter of 1882, along the windswept plains of Montana Territory, most folks had enough sense to stay inside when the snow started falling, but Rosalie Harper wasn't most folks. 8 months pregnant and recently widowed, she stood in her frozen dooryard with nothing but raw timber, rusted nails, and a will that burned hotter than the wood stove she couldn't afford to keep lit. Her husband's death had left her with dying livestock, mounting debts, and neighbors who whispered she'd never make it through winter alone. They were probably right. But Rosalie had learned something about herself in those first bitter weeks of widowhood. She'd rather die building something with her own hands than live begging for charity. What she didn't know was that her stubborn fight for survival would catch the attention of the one man in 3 counties who understood what it meant to carry the weight of the world on weary shoulders. But would his help come in time to save what mattered most?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The wedding ring caught the pale morning light as Rosalie twisted it around her finger, a habit she'd developed since Thomas passed 3 months ago. The simple gold band had grown loose on her thinning hand, but she couldn't bring herself to remove it. It was the last tangible piece of the man who'd brought her to this godforsaken stretch of Montana Territory, full of dreams about fertile soil and endless possibilities. Those dreams lay buried now beneath 2 feet of November snow, along with Thomas himself, in the small cemetery behind the Lutheran church in Willow Creek. The preacher had spoken of God's plan and eternal rest, but all Rosalie could think about was the half-finished barn foundation Thomas had started in September, the livestock huddled in the inadequate lean-to, and the baby growing inside her that would arrive whether she was ready or not. Their homestead sat 5 miles west of town, a modest cabin and 40 acres that Thomas had claimed with such enthusiasm just 2 years prior. He'd been a carpenter back in Ohio, skilled with his hands and possessed of an optimism that made even the harshest prairie winter seem manageable. "We'll build something lasting here, Rose," he'd told her as they'd watched the sun set over their new land. "Something our children will be proud of." The irony wasn't lost on her now as she stood at the kitchen window watching her 3 remaining cattle huddle against the wind. Thomas had started that barn with such confidence, laying out the foundation stones with the precision of a man who'd built dozens of structures. But the consumption that had been quietly eating away at his lungs finally claimed him before he could raise the first wall. The doctor in Willow Creek had done what he could, but frontier medicine had its limits, and Thomas Harper had died on a Tuesday morning in August, leaving behind a pregnant wife, a handful of livestock, and a foundation that led to nowhere. Neighbors had been kind enough in those first weeks. Martha Brennan from the adjacent homestead had brought casseroles and offered to help with chores. Even stern old Eric Johansson had stopped by to check on the livestock. But as autumn deepened into winter, the visits became less frequent. People had their own struggles, their own preparations for the bitter months ahead. Rosalie understood, even if the understanding came wrapped in loneliness. What she couldn't understand was the letter that had arrived just last week from the Consolidated Land Company. Written in precise legal language, it informed her that her husband had been behind on the mortgage payments, a fact Thomas had never mentioned, and that the company was prepared to offer generous settlement for the property. The alternative, the letter suggested with bureaucratic politeness, was foreclosure proceedings that would commence after the first of the year. She'd read that letter a dozen times, searching for some escape clause Thomas might have built into their agreement. But the truth was stark as winter morning. Without the autumn harvest Thomas had planned, without his carpentry skills to bring in extra income, she was slowly drowning in debt. The generous settlement would barely cover her debts and leave her with enough to reach her sister in Denver, where she could raise her child in the relative safety of city life. But something in Rosalie rebelled against that sensible solution. Maybe it was the way Thomas's tools still hung in the shed, organized with the same careful precision he'd brought to everything. Maybe it was the memory of his hands guiding hers as he taught her to measure twice and cut once. Or maybe it was simply the stubborn streak her mother had always warned would get her into trouble. The barn Thomas had started measured 30 by 40 feet, large enough to house their small herd, and store sufficient hay to last the winter. The foundation was solid. Thomas had seen to that, and the lumber was already cut and seasoned. What remained was the seemingly impossible task of raising walls and a roof before the deepest cold arrived. "You're mad as a March hare," she told herself, but the words held no conviction. She'd been talking to herself more frequently since Thomas passed, finding comfort in the sound of a human voice, even her own. A woman in your condition, trying to build a barn. But as she studied, the foundation stones visible through the snow, she felt something that had been absent since Thomas's death: purpose. The baby kicked inside her as if in agreement, and she placed both hands on her swollen belly. "What do you think, little one? Should we show these people what Harper women are made of?" The baby's response was another kick, more insistent this time, and Rosalie found herself smiling for the first time in weeks. She pulled Thomas's old coat from the peg by the door. It hung loose on her frame, but would accommodate her growing belly, and stepped into the crisp morning air. The barn foundation sat beneath a blanket of snow, but the stones Thomas had so carefully laid were still visible. She kicked away the snow from one corner, revealing the precise masonry work that had been his pride. Each stone fitted perfectly with its neighbors, creating a level base that would last for generations. Thomas had built foundations to endure, and this one would not disappoint him. Her nearest neighbor, Martha Brennan, appeared at the property line just as Rosalie was measuring the foundation's dimensions with a length of rope. Martha was a sturdy woman in her 50s, the kind of frontier wife who could birth a calf, preserve a harvest, and defend her property with equal competence. But her expression now was one of concern rather than admiration. "Rosalie Harper, what in heaven's name are you doing out here?" "Planning," Rosalie replied, not looking up from her measurements. "Thomas cut all the lumber for the walls. It's seasoned and ready." "Planning what, exactly?" Martha's voice carried the careful tone reserved for people who might be losing their grip on sanity. "To finish what my husband started." Rosalie straightened, meeting Martha's worried gaze. "To build this barn before the baby comes." Martha was quiet for a long moment, studying the foundation, the stacked lumber under its tarp covering, and the woman who proposed to turn one into the other. "That's man's work, Rose. Heavy work. Dangerous work for someone in your condition?" "Maybe." "So," Rosalie agreed. "But it's also necessary work. Those cattle won't survive the winter in that lean-to, and I won't survive losing them. You could sell. Take that company's offer and start fresh somewhere warmer." "I could," Rosalie said. "But I won't." Something in her tone must have conveyed the finality of that decision, because Martha's expression shifted from concern to a kind of resigned respect. "You're as stubborn as Thomas ever was." "I'm hoping that's enough." Martha studied the foundation once more, then sighed. "My Eric knows construction. He could spare a day or two to help with the heavy lifting." "I appreciate that, Martha. I truly do. But this is something I need to do myself. Pride's a cold companion, Roz." "So is charity," Rosalie replied gently. "I'm not above accepting help, but I need to know I can do this. For Thomas. For the baby. For myself." Martha nodded slowly, understanding passing between the two women. "Well then, you'll need to start with the sill plates. Thomas always said a building's only as strong as what it sits on." As Martha returned to her own homestead, Rosalie remained by the foundation, watching the sun climb higher over the snow-covered prairie. In the distance, a rider moved slowly along the horizon, too far away to identify, but close enough to remind her that she wasn't entirely alone in this vast landscape. The figure paused for a moment, seeming to look in her direction, before continuing on its way. She didn't know it then, but that distant observer was Wes Calder, owner of the largest ranch in 3 counties, a man whose wealth was matched only by his reputation for keeping to himself. What drew his attention to the small homestead wasn't immediately clear, even to him. Perhaps it was the sight of a woman working alone in the snow, or the stubborn dignity in her posture as she measured and planned. Whatever the reason, Wes found himself thinking about the scene long after he'd ridden out of sight. Back at the homestead, Rosalie spent the rest of the morning inventorying Thomas's tools and materials. The task was both practical and emotional, each tool a memory of her husband's skilled hands. His level, worn smooth by years of use. His square, its edges nicked but still true. His saw, its teeth sharp and ready. Thomas had maintained his tools with the same care he'd shown her, and they would serve his final project well. The lumber was stacked under heavy canvas, protected from the weather but accessible. Thomas had calculated the materials down to the last board foot, his neat handwriting filling a small notebook she found in his tool chest. Wall studs, floor joists, roof trusses, everything was accounted for, waiting for the hands that would. Never complete the work, but other hands could finish what his had started. Smaller hands, perhaps, and less experienced, but guided by the same determination that had brought Thomas Harper to Montana Territory in the first place. As the snow began to fall again, Rosalie stood in the doorway of the cabin, one hand resting. On her belly, the other holding Thomas's notebook. Tomorrow, she would begin. She didn't notice the rider who had returned, sitting motionless on his horse at the edge of her property, watching the smoke rise from her chimney as evening settled over the prairie. Wes Calder sat there for nearly an hour, wrestling with thoughts he couldn't quite name before finally turning his horse toward home. But he would be back. Something about the scene, the small cabin, the ambitious foundation, the woman who refused to bend before the wind had awakened something in him that had been dormant for far too long. The first wooden stake went into the frozen ground with a satisfying thud that echoed across the prairie. Rosalie stood back, breathing hard from the effort, and wiped her mittened hand across her forehead. The temperature had dropped overnight, and her breath formed small clouds in the bitter air, but she felt warmer than she had in months. Stake marked the corner where the first wall would rise, a tangible commitment to the impossible task she'd set herself. She'd been working since dawn, using Thomas's maul to drive stakes at precise intervals along the foundation. Each stake represented a wall stud, positioned exactly 16 inches apart, according to Thomas's careful notes. The repetitive work was meditative, allowing her mind to focus on the rhythm of measurement and marking rather than the magnitude of what lay ahead. By mid-morning, she had completed one full wall's worth of stakes, their raw wood standing like small sentinels against the snow. The sight filled her with a satisfaction she hadn't expected. This was more than planning now. This was the beginning of actual construction. Mrs. Harper. The voice startled her from her concentration. She turned to see young Billy Patterson, trudging through the snow, his cheeks red from the cold and his eyes wide with curiosity. Billy was Martha Brennan's nephew, staying with his aunt while his parents established their own claim further west. "Morning, Billy," she called back, leaning on the maul. "Shouldn't you be helping your aunt with chores?" "She sent me over too." "Check on you," Billy said, slightly out of breath. "Said she heard hammering and wanted to make sure you weren't doing anything foolish." Rosalie smiled despite herself. Martha's concern was touching, even when delivered through the diplomatic service of a 12-year-old boy. "Tell your aunt I'm just marking measurements. Nothing foolish about that." Billy studied the stakes with the serious expression of someone trying to understand adult mysteries. "You really going to build a barn all by yourself?" "I'm going to. Try. My pa says women aren't strong enough for construction work." "Your pa's probably right about most women," Rosalie said diplomatically. "But sometimes we surprise ourselves with what we can do when we have to." Billy nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Can I help?" The offer, innocent and genuine, touched something deep in Rosalie's chest. "I appreciate that, Billy, but this is something I need to do myself. Besides, your aunt needs you more than I do." "Yes, ma'am." Billy hesitated, then asked, "Why is it so important?" "Building the barn yourself, I mean. Folks would help if you asked." It was a fair question, and one Rosalie had been asking herself. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "we need to prove things to ourselves. And sometimes we need to honor the people we've lost by finishing what they started." Billy considered this with the gravity of youth. "My ma says God helps those who help themselves. Your ma's a wise woman." After Billy left, Rosalie returned to her work with renewed purpose. The stakes continued to mark her progress corner. Posts, wall studs, door, and window openings. Each one represented a decision made, a commitment kept. By afternoon, she had staked out the entire perimeter of the barn, 30 feet by 40 feet of marked foundation that looked both impossibly large and encouragingly real. The work was taking its toll, though. Her back ached from bending and lifting, and the baby seemed to be protesting the unusual activity with more frequent kicks. She was resting against the foundation wall, one hand pressed to her side, when she noticed the rider. He sat his horse at the edge of her property, motionless, as a statue, watching her work. The distance made it impossible to make out his features, but something about his posture suggested careful observation rather than casual interest. Rosalie felt a prickle of unease. Lone women on the frontier learned to be wary of unexpected visitors, especially ones who watched from a distance rather than approaching openly. The rider remained there for several minutes, long enough for Rosalie to grow genuinely concerned. She was reaching for Thomas's rifle, which she kept propped against the foundation stones, when the figure finally moved. Instead of approaching, however, he turned his horse and rode away, disappearing over a rise in the prairie. The encounter left her unsettled. There had been something deliberate about the observation, as if the rider were evaluating rather than simply curious. She made a mental note to mention it to Martha, who knew everyone in the county and would be able to identify the mysterious horseman. Her unease deepened when she returned to the cabin that evening to find another letter waiting for her. This one bore the letterhead of the Consolidated Land Company, but the tone was different from the first correspondence. Where the previous letter had been formally polite, this one carried an undercurrent of impatience. "Dear Mrs. Harper," it began, "we have not yet received your response to our previous offer regarding the purchase of your property. We wish to remind you that the terms of your late husband's mortgage agreement require current payments, which we understand you are unable to make. While we remain willing to offer a fair settlement, we must advise you that our offer will not remain open indefinitely. We strongly encourage you to consider your situation carefully and respond within 30 days. Sincerely, James Morrison, Regional Agent." Rosalie read the letter twice, her anger growing with each word. The company's definition of fair settlement would leave her with barely enough money to reach Denver, let alone establish a new life there. Worse, the letter's tone suggested they viewed her situation as a foregone conclusion, a woman alone, clearly incapable of meeting her obligations, who would eventually be forced to accept whatever terms they offered. She crumpled the letter and threw it into the stove, watching the flames consume Morrison's careful threats. Let them wait for their response. She had a barn to build. The next morning brought fresh snow and a bitter wind that made outdoor work nearly impossible. Rosalie spent the day indoors, studying Thomas's construction notes and planning her approach to the actual building. The notebooks were filled with his careful observations about materials, techniques, and timing. Reading them was like having a conversation with her dead husband, his practical voice guiding her through the complexities of construction. "Wall frames first," she read aloud, tracing his words with her finger. "Build them on the ground, then raise them into position. Check for square at every step." The notes were accompanied by detailed sketches showing how each joint should fit, how to ensure the structure would be both strong and true. When the weather cleared the following day, Rosalie began the actual construction. The first wall frame was the most critical. It would set the standard for everything that followed. She selected the straightest boards from Thomas's lumber pile and began measuring and cutting, following his notes exactly. The work was slower than she'd hoped, complicated by her pregnancy and the need to double-check every measurement. But it was progress. The sound of construction carried across the prairie, drawing curious visitors. Old Eric Johansson stopped by to watch her work, his weathered face creased with concern. "You sure about this, Mrs. Harper? Building's dangerous work, especially alone." "I'm being careful," Rosalie assured him, not pausing in her work. "Careful's good, but careful don't make up for lack of help. You need someone to hold the other end of them boards. I'm managing." Eric studied the partially completed wall frame, his experienced eye noting the precise joints and careful measurements. "You're doing good work," he admitted grudgingly. "Your husband taught you well." He taught me to measure twice and cut once, Rosalie said, and to never start something I wasn't prepared to finish. That's good advice. But even the best carpenter needs help raising walls. I'll figure something out when I get there. Eric shook his head, but didn't argue further. As he prepared to leave, he paused. You been having any strange visitors lately? Anyone watching the place? Rosalie's hammer stopped mid-swing. Why do you ask? Martha mentioned seeing a rider out this way. Someone who didn't belong. We keep an eye out for each other out here, you know. I saw someone yesterday. Too far away to identify. Well, you be careful. These are uncertain times, and a woman alone ... He didn't finish the thought, but the implication was clear. After Eric left, Rosalie found herself glancing frequently toward the horizon, looking for signs of the mysterious rider. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, offering countless places for someone to observe without being seen. The thought was not comforting. She worked until the light began to fade, completing the first wall frame and starting on the heating. Second, the progress was encouraging, but the physical demands were becoming harder to ignore. Her back ached constantly now, and the baby seemed to be running out of room, making even simple movements uncomfortable. As she gathered her tools for the day, she noticed fresh horse tracks in the snow near the property line. Someone had been watching again, close enough to leave clear prints, but still at a distance that suggested surveillance rather than social. Calling. The tracks were large, indicating a substantial horse and rider, but told her nothing about the identity of her observer. At evening, as she sat by the fire with Thomas's notebook open in her lap, Rosalie made a decision that would prove to be the turning point in her struggle. Tomorrow, she would begin raising the first wall. It was a job that properly required several people, but she was tired of waiting for proper circumstances. She had stakes in the ground, a solid foundation, and a wall frame ready to lift. It was time to discover what she was truly capable of. Outside, the wind howled across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of harder weather to come. But inside the cabin, warmed by her own determination as much as by the fire, Rosalie Harper planned her next impossible step. The stakes she'd driven into the frozen ground weren't just markers for construction. They were declarations of intent, promises made to herself and to the memory of the man who'd brought her to this harsh, beautiful place. She didn't know that miles away, in the warmth of a much grander house, another person was making plans that would intersect with hers. Wes Calder sat in his study, staring into his own fire, troubled by thoughts of a pregnant woman working alone in the snow. He'd ridden by her place twice now, drawn by something he couldn't name and reluctant to examine too closely. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would mind his own business. But even as he made that promise, he knew it was one he wouldn't keep. Thomas's carpenter tools felt different in Rosalie's hands than they had when he'd guided her through simple repairs around the cabin. A hammer seemed heavier, the saw more unwieldy, and a level required constant attention to keep true. But there was something reassuring about their worn handles, smoothed by years of Thomas's grip, as if his hands were somehow still guiding hers through the work. She'd been awake since before dawn, preparing for the day's challenge, raising the first wall frame. The structure lay complete on the ground beside the foundation, its joints tight and measurements precise according to Thomas's exacting standards. Getting it from horizontal to vertical, however, would require every bit of ingenuity she could muster. The morning air was sharp enough to make her lungs ache, but Rosalie barely noticed the cold. She'd rigged a system of ropes and pulleys using equipment from Thomas's tool collection, anchoring the pulleys to stakes driven deep into the frozen ground. It wasn't elegant, but Thomas had always said that effective trumped elegant every time. "Show me what you taught me," she whispered to the memory of her husband as she positioned herself at the rope. The baby kicked in response to her exertion, and she paused to place a reassuring hand on her belly. "We're doing this together, little one, all three of us." The first pull on the rope lifted one end of the wall frame barely 6 inches off the ground. The second pull gained another foot. Slowly, methodically, she worked the frame upward, pausing frequently to check that it was tracking true and wouldn't bind against the foundation stones. The work was exhausting, made more difficult by her growing bulk, but each inch of progress felt like a victory. She was halfway to vertical when Martha Brennan appeared at the property line, her face a mask of concern and disapproval. Rosalie Harper, what in the name of all that's holy are you doing? Raising a wall, Rosalie panted, not letting go of the rope. By yourself? In your condition? Martha abandoned any pretense of politeness and marched across the snow-covered ground. You'll kill yourself and that baby. I'm being careful. Careful would be waiting for help. This is pure stubbornness. Rosalie paused in her pulling, wiping sweat from her forehead despite the freezing air. Martha, I appreciate your concern, but I need to do this. Needs got nothing to do with it. This is pride talking, and pride's a luxury you can't afford. Martha studied the partially raised wall frame, her experienced eye noting the careful joinery and precise angles. Though I'll admit, you're doing good work. Thomas would be proud of the craftsmanship. Then help me finish it. Martha was quiet, for a long moment, wrestling with her own protective instincts. If I help, will you promise to be more sensible about the heavy work? I'll promise to be as sensible as circumstances allow. It wasn't the assurance Martha wanted, but it was apparently enough. Together, the two women worked the wall frame upward, Martha's strength and experience making the task significantly easier. When the frame finally settled into its brackets on the foundation, perfectly plumb and square, both women stepped back with satisfaction. There, Martha said, brushing sawdust from her coat. That's how it's done when folks have the sense to work together. Thank you, Rosalie said simply. I couldn't have managed it alone. No, you couldn't have. And you won't manage the rest alone either. This barn's going to require more help than one pregnant woman can provide. Before Rosalie could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Two riders were approaching from the direction of town, moving at a purposeful pace that suggested official business rather than social calling. As they drew closer, Rosalie recognized one of them, James Morrison, the land company agent whose letters had been growing increasingly insistent. Morrison was a thin man in his 40s, dressed in the kind of city clothes that looked out of place on the frontier. His companion was younger and broader, with the hard look of someone accustomed to enforcing other people's decisions. They reined in their horses just outside the property line, Morrison's pale eyes taking in the construction scene with obvious displeasure. Mrs. Harper, Morrison called out, not dismounting. I see you received our recent correspondence. I did, Rosalie replied, her voice steady despite the flutter of anxiety in her chest. And yet you seem to be proceeding with improvements to the property, rather than considering our offer. The property's still mine until it isn't. Morrison's smile was thin and humorless. Mrs. Harper, let's speak plainly. You're 3 months behind on mortgage payments, with no visible means of making them current. Building a barn you can't afford on land you're about to lose strikes me as unwise. What strikes me as unwise, Martha interjected, is a man riding onto someone's property uninvited to deliver threats. Morrison's attention shifted to Martha, his expression calculating. Mrs. Brennan, isn't it? I believe your own property borders this one. Perhaps you'd be interested to know that Consolidated Land has been authorized to make offers on additional parcels in this area. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Martha's jaw tightened, but her voice remained level. Is that so? Well, you can tell Consolidated Land that I'm not interested in any offers, subtle or otherwise. Times change, Mrs. Brennan. What seems secure today may not remain so tomorrow. Rosalie stepped forward, her own anger overriding her fear. Mr. Morrison, I believe you've delivered your message. I'd appreciate it if you'd leave my property now. Our property, Morrison corrected mildly. According to the terms of the mortgage, Consolidated Land holds equitable title until the debt is satisfied. But very well, we'll leave you to your construction project. I trust you'll be in touch soon regarding our offer. As the two men rode away, Martha moved closer to Rosalie, her face grim. That was more than a social call. They're pressuring you hard. Harder than I expected, Rosalie admitted. And the threat to you wasn't subtle at all. Let them threaten. I've been on this land for 15 years, and I'm not about to be scared off by some company man in fancy clothes. Martha paused, studying Rosalie's face. But they're right about one thing: you are behind on payments. How far behind? Far. Enough that they have legal standing. Thomas kept the financial details to himself, and I didn't realize how precarious things were until after he passed. And this barn's your answer to that? It's the beginning of an answer. Without it, I lose. The livestock. Without the livestock, I lose any chance of making the land pay. With it? Rosalie shrugged. With it? I might have a fighting chance. Martha nodded slowly. Then we'd better make sure it gets built right. But Rosalie, you've got to understand, this kind of pressure from a land company usually means they have reasons beyond a simple foreclosure. They want your property for something specific. Asterisk, what kind of something? Hard to say. Could be mineral rights. Could be they're assembling a larger parcel for development. Either way, they're not going to give up easily. The conversation was interrupted by the baby's vigorous kicking, hard enough to make Rosalie wince and place both hands on her belly. Martha noticed immediately. How are you feeling? Really feeling, not just what you think you should say. Tired. Rosalie admitted. My back aches most of the time now, and the baby seems to be running out of room. But I'm managing. Have you seen Dr. Matthews recently? Not since last month. He said everything looked normal, but that was before I started this project. You need to see him again. Soon. And not just for the baby's sake. If something happens to you, none of this matters. Rosalie knew Martha was right, but the thought of taking time away from construction felt like admitting defeat. Every day she delayed was another day closer to the deeper cold of winter. Another day for the land company to increase their pressure. That afternoon, she worked alone on the second wall frame, her movements slower and more deliberate than they'd been in the morning. The confrontation with Morrison had shaken her more than she wanted to admit, not just because of the immediate threat, but because of what it revealed about the forces arrayed against her. She wasn't just fighting the weather and her own physical limitations. She was fighting people with resources and legal authority who wanted her gone. The work provided a refuge from such thoughts. Thomas's tools responded to her touch with increasing familiarity, and she found herself falling into the rhythm he'd taught her: measure, mark, cut, fit, secure. Each joint completed was a small victory. Each board placed correctly, a step closer to her goal dot as the sun began to set. Painting the snow-covered prairie in shades of gold and purple, Rosalie stood back to survey her progress. One wall stood, complete and true. A second was nearly ready for raising, and the foundation waited patiently for the structure that would complete Thomas's vision. The sight filled her with something she hadn't felt since his death: hope. She was gathering her tools when she noticed the rider again, silhouetted against the darkening sky. This time, however, the figure didn't maintain its distance. As she watched, horse and rider approached slowly, deliberately, until she could make out details that had been hidden by distance in previous sightings. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, sitting his horse with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle. His clothes were well made but practical, and his face, shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, suggested someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. Most striking was his stillness. He sat his horse without the fidgeting or restlessness that marked most riders, as if he could remain there indefinitely if necessary. When he was close enough for conversation, he reined in his horse and touched the brim of his hat. Mrs. Harper. You have me at a disadvantage, Rosalie replied, her hand moving instinctively to Thomas's hammer. You seem to know who I am, but I don't believe we've been introduced. Wes Calder, he said simply, as if the name should explain everything that it did, in a way. Everyone in the county knew of Wes Calder, owner of the largest ranch for 50 miles in any direction. He was wealthy, powerful, and notably reclusive, the kind of man whose rare appearances in town generated conversation for weeks afterward. What he was doing at her small homestead was a mystery that made Rosalie deeply uneasy. Mr. Calder, to what do I owe the honor of this visit? I've been watching you work, he said, his voice carrying a gravelly quality that suggested a man who chose his words carefully. Impressive what you've accomplished. Thank you, but I doubt you rode all this way to offer construction compliments. For the first time, something that might have been a smile touched the corners of his mouth. Direct. I appreciate that in a person. He studied the completed wall frame, his experienced eye noting details that would escape most observers. Your husband knew his trade. He did. And he taught me enough to finish what he started. Maybe he did. Calder's gaze shifted from the construction to Rosalie herself, taking in her swollen figure and determined posture. Question is whether you should be the one doing the finishing. The comment stung, carrying as it did the same implications of feminine inadequacy she'd been hearing from everyone except Martha. Mr. Calder, I'm sure you mean well, but I've had quite enough advice for one day about what I should and shouldn't be doing. Not advice, he said. Observation. You're doing good work, but winter's coming hard, and you're running out of time. Then I'd better get back to work instead of standing here talking. Instead of taking the hint to leave, Calder dismounted, his movements economical and sure. Mind if I take a closer look at the construction? Rosalie wanted to refuse, but something in his manner suggested this wasn't entirely a social request. I suppose not, and I'm not looking for partners or investors. If that's what this is about, it's not. He approached the wall frame, running his hands along the joints with the familiarity of someone who understood construction. Mortise and tenon, properly fitted. Your husband knew traditional joinery. He learned from his father, who learned from his, said it was the only way to build something that would last. He was right. Calder straightened, his attention returning to Rosalie. Mrs. Harper, may I speak plainly? I'd prefer it. You're being watched. Not just by me, by people who don't have your best interests at heart, and you're vulnerable out here, working alone. Are you threatening me, Mr. Calder? Warning you, there's a difference. Rosalie studied his face, trying to read the intentions behind his weathered features. Why would you care what happens to me or my property? The question seemed to catch him off guard, as if he hadn't fully examined his own motivations. Maybe because I respect someone who finishes what they start. Maybe because I don't like seeing people pushed around by companies with more lawyers than conscience. And maybe because you want something yourself. Maybe, he agreed, but not what you think. With that cryptic comment, he remounted his horse, settling into the saddle with fluid grace. Mrs. Harper, you're building something worthwhile here. Be careful who you trust to help you complete it. As he rode away, Rosalie stood in the growing darkness, Thomas's hammer still clutched in her hand, wondering what she'd just witnessed. Wes Calder's visit had been unexpected and unsettling, raising more questions than it answered. But one thing was clear. Her solitary struggle was attracting attention from quarters she hadn't anticipated, and not all of that attention felt benign. The completed wall frame stood silhouetted against the stars, a testament to her determination and a promise of what was to come. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her resolve. But tonight, she had made tangible progress toward Thomas's dream, and that was enough to sustain her through whatever lay ahead. The half-built frame rose against the morning sky like the skeleton of some magnificent creature, its bones clean and true in the pale winter light. Rosalie stood before it with Thomas's coffee cup in her hands, steam rising from the bitter brew as she studied what she'd accomplished and what remained to be done. 3 walls now stood upright, their joints tight and their angles square, but the 4th wall, the one that would hold the heavy barn doors still, lay in pieces on the snow-covered ground. She'd been working for 2 weeks since Wes Calder's unexpected visit, and the progress was more than she'd dared hope for. Her body had adapted to the rhythm of construction, finding reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. The baby seemed to approve of the activity, settling into a comfortable position that allowed her to move more freely than she had. In weeks, the morning's first task was cutting the doorframe, a complex piece of joinery that would require all of Thomas's skills channeled through her increasingly confident hands. She'd studied his notebooks for hours, memorizing the measurements and techniques required to create an opening strong enough to support the massive barn doors while maintaining the structural integrity of the wall dot as she worked, measuring and marking the heavy timbers that would form the doorframe. Rosalie became aware of an unusual sound in the distance, the rhythmic ring of metal on metal that could only mean someone else was working with tools somewhere nearby. The sound was too regular and sustained to be casual repair work, suggesting a substantial project underway. Her curiosity was satisfied an hour later, when young Billy Patterson appeared at the edge of her property, his face bright with excitement. And barely contained news. Mrs. Harper, Mrs. Harper. He called, waving his arms for attention. You've got to come see what's happening at the old Mitchum place. Rosalie set down her saw and turned to face the boy. What's got you so worked? Up, Billy? There's men working there, lots of them. They're building something big. The Mitchum place was an abandoned homestead about a mile west, claimed by a family that had given up after 2 failed harvests and returned east. Rosalie had assumed it would remain empty until spring brought new settlers, but Billy's news suggested otherwise. Asterisk, what kind of men, Billy? Settlers? No, ma'am. These are working men, with wagons full of lumber and tools. And they've got a boss man who rides a real fancy horse. A chill that had nothing to do with the winter air ran down Rosalie's spine. Did you get a good look? At this boss man? Yes, ma'am. Tall fellow, well-dressed. Had 2 other men with him, who looked like they meant business. The description matched James Morrison perfectly, and Rosalie felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. If the land company was establishing a presence in the area, it could only mean they were preparing for a more aggressive approach to acquiring properties. The abandoned Mitchum place would make a perfect base of operations for pressuring the remaining homesteaders. Billy, I want you to go straight home and tell your aunt what you've seen. And tell her I said to be extra careful about strangers for a while. Yes, ma'am. But Mrs. Harper, what do you think they're building? I don't know, son, but I doubt it's anything good for the rest of us. After Billy left, Rosalie tried to return to her work, but concentration proved elusive. The sound of distant construction continued throughout the morning, a constant reminder that she was no longer the only one building in the area. Whatever. Morrison and his company were planning. They were moving quickly to implement it. Her unease deepened when Martha Brennan appeared around midday, her face grim with news. Rose, we need to talk. Rosalie set down her tools and joined Martha beside the completed wall frames. Billy told you about the activity at the Mitchum place? He did, but there's more you need to know. Eric rode into town this morning and heard. Talk. Seems the Consolidated Land Company has been buying up claims all over the county, not just the ones in default. They're offering cash money, more than most folks could hope to get anywhere else. Buying them for what purpose? That's the question everyone's asking, but nobody's got a good answer. What we do know is that they're not interested in farming or ranching. Too much good land being acquired for that kind of development. Rosalie felt a growing sense of urgency, as if time were running out faster than she'd anticipated. Have any of our neighbors taken their offers? The Andersons did yesterday. Packed up and headed for California with more money than they'd see in 10 years of farming. Can't say I blame them. This life's hard enough without fighting companies with deep pockets. The news hit Rosalie like a physical blow. The Andersons' property was adjacent to hers on the north side, which meant the land company now controlled a significant portion of the area. How many others are considering selling? More than I'd like to admit. Times are hard, Rose, and when someone offers you enough money to start over somewhere easier. Martha's voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. What about you? And Eric? We're not selling. This land's our home, and we'll defend it if necessary, but we may be in the minority soon. They worked together through the afternoon, Martha's presence making the task of raising the 4th wall frame much easier than it would have been alone. As they fitted the door frame into position, checking and rechecking its alignment, Rosalie found herself grateful for Martha's steady competence and unquestioning support. You know, Martha said as they secured the final joint, I never thought I'd say this to a pregnant woman building a barn in winter, but you might just pull this off. It's starting to feel possible, Rosalie admitted. 3 walls up, 1, 2. Go, and then the roof structure. The roof's going to be the real challenge. Those trusses are heavy, and the angles have to be perfect, or the whole thing could come down in a heavy snow. Thomas left detailed drawings. If I follow them exactly ... Following drawings and hoisting heavy timbers 30 feet in the air are 2 different things, Martha said gently. That's going to require help, Rose. More help than you've been willing to accept. Before Rosalie could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 2 riders were coming from the direction of town, but these weren't the threatening figures of Morrison and his associate. Instead, Rosalie recognized Dr. Matthews, the county's only physician, accompanied by a woman she didn't know. Dr. Matthews was a man in his 60s who'd seen every kind of frontier, hardship, and developed a bedside manner that mixed kindness with uncompromising directness. As he dismounted, his practiced eye took in Rosalie's condition and the construction scene with equal attention. "Mrs. Harper," he said by way of greeting, "I hear you've been keeping busy." "Dr. Matthews, this is unexpected. Mrs. Brennan sent word that you might benefit from a medical consultation. This is Sarah Chun, my assistant. She's had training in midwifery and women's health." Sarah Chun was a small, precise woman with intelligent eyes and calloused hands. That spoke of practical experience. She moved with the confident efficiency of someone accustomed to making quick decisions in difficult circumstances. "Mrs. Harper," Sarah said, "I'd like to examine you, if you're willing. Building projects are admirable, but so is ensuring the health of both mother and child." Rosalie wanted to protest that she felt fine, that the examination was unnecessary. But the concerned expressions on both women's faces suggested this wasn't entirely a request. "I suppose that would be wise." The examination took place in the privacy of the cabin. Sarah's hands gentle but thorough as she checked Rosalie's condition. Dr. Matthews waited outside with Martha, their low conversation occasionally audible through the thin cabin walls. "You're in remarkably good health," Sarah announced when she'd finished. "The baby's position is good, heartbeat strong, and you show no signs of the complications I might expect from someone in your situation." "My situation?" "Working construction while 8 months pregnant," Sarah said with a slight smile. "It's not exactly standard medical advice, but there's no immediate danger." "Not immediate, no. But Mrs. Harper, you need to understand that labor could begin at any time now. When it does, you'll need help, and you'll need it quickly. Being isolated out here, especially with winter weather. I understand the risks. Do you? Because I'm not sure you do." Sarah's voice carried a gentle firmness. "I've delivered babies in frontier conditions, and I've seen what can go wrong when help isn't available. You need to make arrangements, people you can call on, a plan for getting word to town if necessary. I'll talk to Martha about it." "Good. And Mrs. Harper? When the time comes, don't try to be heroic. Send for help immediately, even if it means abandoning your work for a few days." After the medical visit, Rosalie returned to the barn construction with mixed feelings. Sarah's reassurance about her health was welcome, but the reminder of her vulnerability was unsettling. She was racing against time in more ways than she'd fully realized, not just the weather and the land company's pressure, but the approach of birth itself. As evening approached, she stood before the nearly complete frame of the barn, 4 walls standing proud and true against the darkening sky. The structure was beginning to look like what Thomas had envisioned, a sturdy, practical building that would serve their needs for generations. But it was also a reminder of how much remained to be done and how little time she might have to complete it. The sound of a horse approaching drew her attention to the familiar figure of Wes Calder riding slowly across the snow-covered prairie. This time, however, he wasn't alone. Behind him, a wagon followed, loaded with what appeared to be construction materials. "Asterisk, Mr. Calder," she called as he approached. "Back to check on my progress?" "Among other things," he replied, dismounting with his usual fluid grace. "I brought something you might find useful." The wagon proved to contain a load of seasoned timber, cut to specifications that matched Thomas's notes exactly. More puzzling was the presence of several pieces of specialized hardware metal brackets and reinforcing plates that would be perfect for roof construction, but were expensive and difficult to obtain on the frontier. "I don't understand," Rosalie said, studying the materials. "What is this?" "Call it a loan," Calder said. "I had extra materials from a project of my own, and it seemed wasteful to let them sit unused. Mr. Calder, I can't afford to pay for materials like these." "Did I mention payment? I said it was a loan." Rosalie studied his face, searching for the catch she was certain must exist. What kind of loan? The kind where you use what you need and return what you don't. No interest, no timeline, no strings attached. There are always strings attached. Not this time. His voice carried a conviction that was hard to argue with. Mrs. Harper, I've been watching you work for weeks now. You're building something worthwhile here, and you're doing it the right way. Sometimes that deserves support. Why? The question came out more sharply than she'd intended. Why would you care about my barn or my success? Calder was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the barn's frame silhouetted against the stars. Maybe because I recognize someone who refuses to quit when quitting would be easier. Maybe because I've seen too many good people driven off. Their land by companies that measure everything in dollars and nothing in human worth. And maybe because you have your own reasons that you're not sharing. Maybe, he agreed. But does it matter if the help is genuine? It was a fair question, and one Rosalie couldn't answer immediately. She needed the materials desperately, and they were exactly what Thomas would have specified for the roof construction. Whether Calder's motives were entirely altruistic seemed less important than the reality of what he was offering. All right, she said finally. I'll accept your loan with the understanding that I'll repay you somehow when I'm able. Fair enough. Calder began unloading the wagon with practiced efficiency, stacking the materials where they would be protected from the weather but easily accessible for construction. Mrs. Harper, there's something else you should know. The activity at the Mitcham place, it's not just a regional office. They're building a company town. A what? Housing for workers, offices for management, warehouses for equipment. The kind of infrastructure you build when you're planning to be somewhere for a long time and need a lot of people to do it. What kind of work requires that much infrastructure? The kind that involves moving large amounts of earth and rock. Mining, most likely, though I haven't been able to determine what they're after. The revelation put everything in a new and more ominous light. If Consolidated Land was planning a mining operation, they would need to control large tracts of land, including hers. The pressure to sell would only intensify, and her small act of defiance in building the barn would become an even greater obstacle to their plans. How long do you think I have? She asked. Until they make their next move? Hard to say. But Mrs. Harper, when they do move, it's going to be with more force than a few polite letters and veiled threats. As Calder prepared to leave, he paused beside his horse, studying the barn frame one more time. You're doing something important here, he said quietly. Not just for yourself, but for everyone who believes that people should be able to make their own choices about their land and their lives. Don't let them convince you otherwise. After he rode away, Rosalie stood alone in the darkness, surrounded by the materials that would allow her to complete Thomas's vision. The barn frame loomed above her, more than half finished now, a testament to determination and skill. But it was also becoming something more a symbol of resistance against forces that would reduce everything to profit and loss. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her resolve. But tonight, she had walls standing and materials waiting. And for the first time since Thomas's death, she began to believe that she might actually succeed in the impossible task she'd set herself. The half-built frame stood ready for its roof, and Rosalie Harper stood ready to give it one. A pocket watch gleamed in the lamplight as Wes Calder turned it over in his weathered hands, its gold surface worn smooth by 3 generations of Calders who had carried it before him. His grandfather's initials were still visible on the back, engraved in the careful script of a craftsman who'd taken pride in his work. The watch had been a symbol of the family's rise from homesteaders to cattle barons, a tangible reminder of what hard work and determination could accomplish on the frontier. Now it felt more like a weight than a treasure, heavy with the expectations of men who'd built an empire, but couldn't foresee how their grandson would struggle to live up to their legacy. Wes set the watch on his desk and stared out the window of his study, where the lights of his ranch spread across the valley like fallen stars. By any measure, he was a successful man, wealthy, respected, in control of more land and livestock than his grandfather could have imagined. So why did he feel like he was failing? The question had been haunting him more frequently since he'd started watching Rosalie Harper's impossible project. There was something in her stubborn determination that reminded him of his grandfather's. Stories about the early days, when success meant simply surviving another winter and building something with your own hands. Somewhere along the way, the Calder legacy had become about accumulating rather than creating, about expanding holdings rather than improving lives. His father had been the architect of that transformation, turning a modest cattle operation into a regional powerhouse through shrewd deals, political connections, and an unwavering focus on profit. When Wes inherited the operation 5 years ago, he'd continued along the same path, adding to the family holdings and increasing their influence. But he'd also inherited his father's debts, not financial ones, but moral obligations that sat uneasily on his conscience. Chief among those obligations was the family's relationship with Consolidated Land Company. His father had been one of their early investors, providing capital and local knowledge in exchange for substantial returns on successful acquisitions. It had seemed like a natural partnership at the time. The land company identified properties with development potential. The Calders provided the regional expertise and political connections necessary to secure them. Everyone profited, and the frontier was developed more efficiently than it would have been through individual efforts. Watching Rosalie Harper struggle to save her small homestead had forced Wes to confront the hue and cost of such efficiency. Behind every successful acquisition was a family displaced, a dream abandoned, a lifetime of work reduced to a monetary transaction. His father had dismissed such concerns as sentimentality, arguing that progress required difficult choices and that the greatest good came from allowing the most capable to control resources. Wes was no longer certain that his family qualified as the most capable, or that their version of progress was worth the price others paid for it. The sound of boots on the front porch interrupted his brooding. His foreman, Carl Hendricks, appeared in the doorway of the study, his hat in his hands and his expression carefully neutral. Carl had worked for the Calders for 20 years, long enough to read his boss's moods and navigate the complexities of ranch politics with diplomatic skill. "Evening, Mr. Calder. Sorry to disturb you, but we've got a situation that needs your attention." "What kind of situation?" "Riders from the Consolidated camp. They're asking questions about our survey markers along the eastern boundary, where it borders the Harper place." Wes felt his stomach tighten. The eastern boundary was a source of long-standing confusion, the result of an imprecise survey conducted during his grandfather's time. The Harper property technically overlapped with Calder land by perhaps 10 acres, a discrepancy that had never mattered when Thomas Harper was alive, and the two men maintained friendly relations. But if Consolidated was questioning the boundaries, it suggested they were looking for legal leverage to acquire the Harper property through eminent domain or adverse possession claims. "What did you tell them?" "That they'd need to speak with you directly about any boundary issues." "But Mr. Calder, they seem to know more about our survey records than they should. Someone's been talking to them about our business." The implication was clear and troubling. Consolidated had sources inside the Calder operation, people willing to share confidential information about property boundaries and legal vulnerabilities. It meant the company was playing a deeper game than Wes had realized, one that potentially threatened his own holdings, as well as the smaller homesteaders they were targeting. "Carl, I want you to review all our employment records from the past year. Anyone who's had access to survey documents, property records, anything that might be useful to a land company. And I want to know if anyone's been spending money they shouldn't have." "You think we've got someone on their payroll?" "I think it's possible. And I think we need to find out before they cause any more damage." After Carl left, Wes returned to his contemplation of the pocket watch, but his thoughts were now focused on more immediate concerns. If Consolidated was targeting the boundary dispute as a way to acquire the Harper property, it meant Rosalie's situation was even more precarious than he'd realized. The company wouldn't hesitate to use legal technicalities to seize land they couldn't acquire through financial pressure, and a pregnant widow with limited resources would be easy prey for such tactics. The moral complexities of the situation weighed heavily on him. As an investor in Consolidated, he was technically profiting from their aggressive acquisition strategy. But as a neighbor, and increasingly, as a man who admired Rosalie Harper's courage, he felt obligated to oppose them. The conflict put him in an impossible position. He couldn't actively work against the company without violating his fiduciary duties as an investor. But he couldn't stand by and watch them destroy someone he'd come to respect. The next morning brought news that made his position even more complicated. A messenger arrived from town with a formal request for a meeting with James Morrison, scheduled for the following afternoon at the Consolidated office. The tone was polite but unmistakably official, suggesting this wasn't a social call or routine business discussion. Wes spent the morning preparing for what he suspected would be a confrontational meeting. He reviewed his investment agreements with Consolidated, looking for any clauses that might limit his ability to act independently. He also consulted with his attorney, a cautious man who advised against any actions that might be construed as interfering with the company's legitimate business activities. The ride to the temporary Consolidated office at the old Mitchum place gave him time to observe the company's operation firsthand. What he saw was impressive and ominous in equal measure. They'd constructed a substantial complex of buildings in just 2 weeks, including offices, worker housing, and equipment storage facilities. The level of organization and resources suggested this was far more than a simple land acquisition effort. It was the foundation for a major industrial operation. James Morrison greeted him in a well-appointed office that had been assembled with remarkable efficiency. The man was younger than Wes had expected, perhaps 40 years old, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way through a combination of legal knowledge and financial pressure. Mr. Calder, thank you for coming. I trust you've had an opportunity to observe our progress here. Impressive work, Wes replied diplomatically. You've accomplished a great deal in a short time. Efficiency is essential in our business. Time delays cost money, and money delays progress. Morrison gestured for Wes to take a seat across from his desk. I assume you're curious about why I requested this meeting. I am. We've become aware of some irregularities in the survey records for properties in this area, including the boundary between your ranch and the Harper homestead. As an investor in our company and an affected landowner, we thought you should be informed. Morrison opened a folder and withdrew several documents, survey maps, property deeds, and legal correspondence that Wes recognized from his own files. The fact that Consolidated had access to such detailed information about his holdings confirmed his suspicion that they had inside sources. According to our research, Morrison continued, there's a significant discrepancy between the recorded boundaries of your property and the Harper claim. The overlap amounts to approximately 10 acres of prime bottomland along Willow Creek. That discrepancy has existed for 30 years without causing problems for anyone. Perhaps, but legal clarity is essential for development purposes. We're prepared to resolve the issue through a formal survey and legal arbitration, which would likely result in the disputed acreage being awarded to your ranch as the senior claimant. Wes studied the documents, recognizing the trap being laid for him. If he accepted Consolidated's offer to resolve the boundary dispute in his favor, he would effectively be helping them acquire the Harper property by reducing its size and value. If he refused, they would likely proceed with legal action anyway, but his opposition would be noted and potentially used against him in future dealings. Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your diligence in identifying this issue, but I'm not interested in pursuing a boundary dispute with Mrs. Harper. The current arrangement has worked well for both families. I understand your reluctance to seem aggressive toward a widow in difficult circumstances. But Mr. Calder, we must think about the larger picture. This area is sitting on significant mineral deposits, copper, possibly silver, and developing. Those resources will require clear title to substantial acreage. Individual homesteads with uncertain boundaries make such development extremely difficult. So you're planning a mining operation, a comprehensive resource extraction project that could bring hundreds of jobs and substantial economic development to the region. But it requires assembling large tracts of land under unified ownership. Your cooperation in resolving boundary disputes would be appreciated. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Consolidated expected their investors to support their acquisition efforts, and Wes's reluctance to participate was being noted. If he continued to resist, he might find himself targeted for the same kind of pressure they were applying to the homesteaders. "I'll need time to consider your proposal," he said finally. "Of course. But Mr. Calder, I should mention that time is a factor in these matters. The longer properties remain in uncertain legal status, the more difficult it becomes to proceed with development. We would prefer to resolve these issues through cooperation rather than litigation, but we're prepared for either approach." The meeting concluded with polite formalities, but Wes left with a clear understanding of his position. Consolidated was demanding his active participation in their land acquisition strategy, using his investment in the company and his respect in the community as leverage. If he refused to cooperate, they would likely move against his own holdings, as well as continuing their pressure on the smaller homesteaders. The ride back to his ranch gave him time to consider his options, none of which were particularly appealing. He could cooperate with Consolidated and preserve his own position while betraying the principles that had guided his grandfather's generation. He could oppose them openly and risk losing everything his family had built over 3 generations. Or he could try to find a middle path that satisfied neither his conscience nor his business obligations. As he crested the ridge that overlooked his ranch, Wes caught sight of smoke rising from the direction of the Harper homestead. Even at this distance, he could see the tiny figure of Rosalie working beside the barn frame, her determination visible in every line of her posture. The sight reminded him of his grandfather's stories about the early settlers, people who built their lives through sheer force of will and refused to surrender their dreams to easier circumstances. His grandfather's pocket watch seemed heavier in his vest pocket as he urged his horse toward home. 3 generations of Calders had carried that watch, building a legacy through hard work and careful choices. Now it fell to him to decide what that legacy would ultimately mean, whether it would be remembered as a force for progress and prosperity, or as another example of wealth and power crushing the dreams of ordinary people. The choice, he realized, would define not only his own character, but the future of everyone in the valley. And time, like the steady ticking of his grandfather's watch, was running out for all of them. The shared thermos sat between them on the lumber pile, steam rising from its open mouth like a tiny prayer against the bitter morning air. Rosalie had been surprised when Wes Calder appeared at her worksite just after dawn, carrying the battered metal container and wearing the expression of a man who'd made a difficult decision sometime during the night. "Coffee," he'd said simply, setting the thermos down without ceremony. "Figured you could use some help today." She hadn't refused, partly because the offer seemed genuine and partly because the barn's roof construction was rapidly approaching the limits of what one person could safely manage. The trusses Wes had provided were exactly what Thomas's plans called for, but they were also heavy, unwieldy pieces that required precise placement and careful coordination to install properly. Now, 3 hours into their unlikely partnership, they worked with the easy rhythm of people who understood each other's capabilities without need for constant explanation. Wes handled the heavy lifting and positioning, while Rosalie managed the measuring and securing, their different strengths complementing each other in ways that made the difficult work almost pleasant. "Hand me that brace," Wes said, balancing on the ladder while holding one end of a roof truss in position, the one with the angled cut. Rosalie selected the piece from Thomas's carefully organized stack and passed it up, watching as Wes fitted it into place with the practiced ease of someone who'd done similar work many times before. "You know construction. My grandfather believed every man should understand the work his money paid for. Spent summers as a boy learning carpentry, masonry, even some blacksmithing. He secured the brace with quick, efficient hammer strokes. Never thought I'd use it again after I took over the ranch." "What changed your mind?" "Maybe watching someone do important work the right way." He climbed down from the ladder and moved to the opposite end of the truss. Maybe needing to remember what building something actually feels like. There was a weight to his words that suggested deeper meanings, but Rosalie didn't push for explanations. In the few hours they'd been working together, she'd learned that Wes Calder was a man who chose his words carefully and revealed himself gradually, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. They were positioning the third truss when Martha Brennan appeared, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern as she took in the scene of cooperation. She'd brought fresh bread and hot soup, but her attention was clearly focused on the unexpected presence of the county's most prominent citizen working alongside her. Neighbor Mr. Calder, she said with careful politeness. I wasn't expecting to find you here, Mrs. Brennan. He touched the brim of his hat with the same courtesy he might show a lady at a church social. Your neighbor's building something worth supporting. Indeed she is. But I have to wonder what brings the owner of the largest ranch in 3 counties to help with a small homestead barn. It was a fair question, delivered with the direct honesty that characterized frontier conversation. Wes paused in his work, considering his answer with the same care he'd shown in fitting the roof trusses. Maybe because I've forgotten what it means to build something with your own hands, he said finally. Maybe because Mrs. Harper's doing what my grandfather would have done in the same situation. And maybe because you know something about the forces working against her. The question hung in the air between them, sharp with implications neither Martha nor Rosalie had voiced directly. Wes set down his hammer and met Martha's gaze with steady eyes. Maybe that too. Martha studied his face for a long moment, then nodded as if satisfied with something she'd seen there. Well then, you'd better have some soup before that next truss gets too heavy to lift. The meal was eaten in companionable silence, the 3 of them sitting on the foundation stones and sharing Martha's simple but nourishing food. The barn frame rose around them, no longer just a collection of lumber, but recognizably the structure Thomas had envisioned. The sight filled Rosalie with a satisfaction that was both personal and profound. She was not just building shelter for her livestock, but proving something to herself about what she was capable of accomplishing. How long until you finish? Martha asked, studying the remaining work with an experienced eye. Another week for the roof structure, Rosalie replied. Then the siding and shingles, if the weather holds. Weather won't hold much longer, Wes said quietly. There's a storm coming, maybe 2 days out. Big one, from the feel of the air. Both women looked at him with the attention frontier people reserved for anyone who could read weather signs accurately. Such knowledge could mean the difference between safety and disaster in country where the nearest neighbor might be miles away. How big? Martha asked. Big enough to flatten anything that isn't properly secured, and cold enough to make work impossible for days afterward. The implications were sobering. If a major storm hit before the roof was complete, weeks of work could be destroyed in a single night. Worse, the approaching winter meant there might not be another opportunity to complete the construction before spring. Then we'd better work faster, Rosalie said, rising from her seat on the foundation stones. We? Martha's eyebrows rose at the pronoun. Rosalie looked at Wes, realizing she'd assumed his continued participation without asking for it. I mean, if Mr. Calder is willing to continue helping. I'm willing, he said without hesitation. But Mrs. Harper, you need to understand what accepting my help might mean. There are people who won't approve of our ... collaboration. What people? The kind who expect their business partners to maintain certain loyalties. It was the closest he'd come to acknowledging his connection to Consolidated Land Company, and the admission carried a weight that made the cold air seem even sharper. Rosalie understood instinctively that his help came with risks she hadn't fully considered. Are you saying I shouldn't accept your assistance? I'm saying you should understand what you're accepting. Martha had been following the exchange with growing alarm. Wes, what exactly are you mixed up in with that land company? The use of his first name marked a shift in their relationship, from formal politeness to the direct concern of one neighbor for another. Wes seemed to recognize the significance, his response carrying a weight of honesty that hadn't been present in his earlier, more guarded comments. I'm an investor, Martha. Have been for 3 years since they first approached my father about opportunities in the region. At the time, it seemed like a partnership that would benefit everyone. They had capital and expertise. We had local knowledge and connections. And now I'm beginning to understand that their definition of benefit and mine don't align as well as I thought. Rosalie felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in her mind. The boundary dispute they mentioned in their letter. You could claim part of my land if you wanted to. I could. They're expecting me to. But you won't. No, I won't. But that decision puts me in conflict with people who expect my cooperation. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders coming from the direction of the consolidated camp at a pace that suggested urgent business rather than social calling. As they drew closer, Rosalie recognized James Morrison and 2 men she hadn't seen before, both wearing the kind of clothes that marked them as city people trying to dress for frontier conditions. Morrison reined in his horse at the edge of the property, his pale eyes taking in the scene with obvious displeasure. The presence of Wes Calder seemed to surprise him, though he recovered quickly and managed a thin smile. "Mr. Calder, Mrs. Harper, I trust we're not interrupting important work." "Nothing that can't wait," Wes replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Excellent, Mrs. Harper. I've brought some associates who are interested in discussing your property situation. Perhaps we could step inside for a more comfortable conversation." "I'm comfortable enough right here," Rosalie said, not moving from her position beside the barn frame. Morrison's smile grew thinner. "As you wish, Mrs. Harper. These gentlemen represent the territorial government's Mineral Rights Office. They're conducting a survey of potential mining claims in the area." One of the newcomers, a thin man with nervous eyes, stepped forward. "Mrs. Harper, I'm Edwin Pierce from the territorial capital. We've received reports of significant mineral deposits in this region, and we're authorized to conduct preliminary assessments of private property where such deposits might exist." "Assess how?" "Survey and sampling, primarily. We would need access to your property for perhaps a week, with the understanding that any discoveries would be subject to territorial mining law." Rosalie felt the trap closing around her, though she didn't fully understand its mechanisms. "What does territorial mining law say about discoveries on private property?" Pierce's nervous manner became more pronounced. "Well, that depends on various factors. The territorial government has the right to claim mineral rights for the public good, with appropriate compensation to property owners, of course. Appropriate according to whom? According to fair market assessment conducted by qualified appraisers." Martha snorted with contempt. "Appraisers working for whom?" "The territory or the mining companies." "Mrs. Brennan, I assure you the process is entirely legitimate and regulated by territorial statute." "I'm sure it is," Wes said quietly, his tone carrying an edge that made all 3 visitors shift uncomfortably in their saddles. "Just as I'm sure the timing of this survey is purely coincidental." Morrison's mask of politeness slipped slightly. "Mr. Calder, I'm surprised to find you here. I was under the impression that our meeting yesterday had clarified certain expectations regarding your cooperation with our acquisition efforts. It clarified them very well. Perhaps too well." The exchange was subtle but unmistakably hostile, confirming Rosalie's growing understanding that Wes's assistance was costing him more than she'd realized. The knowledge made her feel both grateful and guilty grateful for his support, but guilty about the price he was paying for it. "Mrs. Harper," Morrison continued, his attention returning to her, "I'm authorized to make you a final offer for your property, 25% above our previous proposal, with immediate cash payment and assistance with relocation expenses. And if I refuse, then Mr. Pierce and his associates will proceed with their mineral survey, as is their legal right. Should they discover significant deposits, the territorial government will likely exercise its eminent domain authority for the public good. In partnership with Consolidated Land Company, no doubt. The territorial government chooses its own development partners based on experience and capability." Rosalie looked at the 3 men, then at the barn frame rising around her, then at the faces of her friends who had risked their own positions to support her impossible dream. The choice being offered was no choice at all: surrender her property voluntarily or have it taken through legal mechanisms she couldn't hope to challenge. "Gentlemen," she said finally, "I appreciate your offers and your legal authority. But this is my land, that's my barn, and you're not welcome here. I'll ask you to leave." Morrison's expression hardened. "Mrs. Harper, you're making a serious mistake. The territorial survey will proceed with or without your cooperation, and resistance will only make your eventual situation more difficult. Then I guess we'll see how difficult things can get." The 3 men exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, Morrison nodded to his companions and gathered his reins. "Very well, Mrs. Harper, but don't say. You weren't given every opportunity to resolve this matter reasonably." As they rode away, the silence that fell over the construction site was heavy with implications none of them wanted to voice. The battle lines had been drawn more clearly than ever, and Rosalie's small act of defiance had escalated into something that would affect everyone in the valley. "Well," Martha said finally, "I don't suppose there's any point in pretending this is just about building a barn anymore." "No," Wes agreed. "I don't suppose there is." Rosalie picked up her hammer and turned back to the roof truss they'd been working on when the visitors arrived. "Then we'd better get this roof finished before that storm hits. I have a feeling we're going to need all the shelter we can get." The thermos sat forgotten on the lumber pile, its contents grown cold while they confronted the reality of forces arrayed against them. But the work continued, 3 people bound together by circumstances they hadn't chosen, but were determined to face with whatever courage and skill they could muster. The barn was no longer just shelter for livestock. It had become a symbol of resistance, a declaration that some things were worth defending regardless of the cost. And in the distance, clouds were gathering that would test both the strength of their construction and the depth of their resolve. The land deed documents spread across the kitchen table like fallen leaves, their yellowed edges and faded ink telling a story that made Rosalie's hands tremble as she read. She'd discovered them quite by accident, searching through Thomas's papers for his original survey notes, but what they revealed changed everything she thought she knew about her husband, her property, and the man who'd been helping her build the barn. The first document was Thomas's original deed, purchased from the Territorial Land Office in 1880, but attached to it, in a separate folder she'd never noticed before, were correspondence and legal papers that painted a very different picture of how her husband had acquired their homestead. Thomas hadn't simply claimed the land through the Homestead Act, as she'd always believed. He'd purchased it from a previous owner named William Calder, Wes's father. Her hands shook as she read through the transaction records. William Calder had sold the Harper property to Thomas at significantly below market value, with unusual terms that included a right of first refusal should the new owners ever decide to sell. More troubling were the mineral rights, which the deed clearly stated remained with the Calder family in perpetuity. Thomas had bought surface rights only, not the complete ownership she'd always assumed they possessed. But the most devastating revelation came in a letter, dated just 2 months before Thomas's death, a letter from William Calder to Thomas that she'd never seen before. In his careful handwriting, the elder Calder had informed her husband the Consolidated Land Company was pressuring him to sell the mineral rights to the Harper property, offering substantial sums for what they claimed were valuable copper and silver deposits beneath the surface. "Tom," the letter read, "they're offering more money than I've ever seen for rights to land I sold you in good faith. I wanted you to know what was happening before they approached you directly. You and Rose have been good neighbors, and I won't sell those rights without your knowledge and agreement. But I also won't lie to you about what they're offering. If you're agreeable, we could split the proceeds and both benefit from what's under your land. If not, I'll tell them the rights aren't available. Your choice, but either way, you should know what you're sitting on." The letter was marked "Received" in Thomas's handwriting, but she could find no record of his response. Had he agreed to the sale? Had he planned to tell her about the mineral rights and the potential windfall before his illness took that opportunity away? Or had he chosen to keep the Calder family's offer secret, preferring to maintain their simple life rather than complicate it with sudden wealth? She was still staring at the documents when a knock at the door interrupted her churning thoughts. Wes Calder stood on her threshold, his hat in his hands and his face showing the strain of whatever internal struggle had brought him to her door. "Mrs. Harper, we need to talk." "Yes," she said quietly. "I believe we do. Please, come in." He followed her into the kitchen, his eyes immediately finding the documents spread across the table. Recognition flickered across his features, followed by something that might have been relief or resignation. "You found them." "I found them." She gestured to a chair across from the papers. "Perhaps you'd like to explain what they mean." Wes sat heavily, his gaze fixed on his father's letter to Thomas. They mean that everything you thought you knew about your property and about my family's involvement with Consolidated is more complicated than either of us wanted it to be. Your father owned my land. He did. Claimed it in 1875. Proved it. Up according to the Homestead Act, and sold it to your husband 5 years later when Thomas made him an offer he couldn't refuse. What kind of offer? Money my father desperately needed to expand the ranch and care for my mother, who was dying of consumption. Thomas had saved every penny from his carpentry work, and he offered to buy the property for enough cash to make a real difference in our family situation. Rosalie studied his face, searching for signs of deception, but finding only the weariness of a man carrying burdens he'd never asked for. And the mineral rights? Standard practice at the time. Homesteaders often retained mineral rights, Wing. They sold surface rights, figuring that if anything valuable was ever discovered, they'd benefit from the original investment in proving up the claim. But you never exercised those rights. My father didn't believe there was anything worth mining. The geology didn't look promising for the kind of large-scale operations that would make mining profitable. It was just insurance, I suppose. Until Consolidated changed the equation. Until Consolidated brought in geologists who found things my father's generation missed. Extensive copper deposits, possibly silver, maybe even traces of gold. Enough to make the mineral rights extremely valuable. Rosalie picked up William Calder's letter to Thomas, reading it again with new understanding. Your father wanted Thomas's permission before selling to Consolidated. He was an honorable man. He'd sold the surface rights to Thomas in good faith, and he didn't want to profit from those mineral rights without Thomas knowing and agreeing. But Thomas never responded. Not that I'm aware of. And after he died, my father felt it would be wrong to approach you during your time of grief. He planned to wait until you'd had time to settle your affairs. But he died first, last winter. Heart attack during a blizzard. And I inherited not just the ranch, but all the decisions my father had been avoiding. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was more complex and troubling than Rosalie had anticipated. So when Consolidated approached you about the mineral rights, I was caught between honoring my father's principles and meeting my financial obligations. The ranch has debts, Mrs. Harper, substantial ones. My father expanded aggressively in his final years, borrowing against future profits that didn't materialize. Without the income from those mineral rights, I may lose everything my grandfather built. And with them, you participate in destroying what Thomas built, yes? The word came out flat and final, acknowledgement of an impossible choice. Either way, I betray someone who trusted my family to do the right thing. Rosalie stood and moved to the window, looking out at the barn frame that rose against the gray sky like a monument to stubborn hope. The structure was nearly complete. Now its roof trusses installed and ready for shingles, its walls solid and true. But the knowledge that she didn't truly own the land beneath it, that her entire struggle might be legally meaningless, threatened to undermine everything she'd fought to accomplish. There's more, isn't there? She said, without turning around. Yes. His voice was barely above a whisper. Consolidated doesn't just want to buy the mineral rights. They want to exercise them immediately, with full-scale mining operations that would require significant surface disruption. How significant? Your cabin, your barn, everything you've built would have to be removed. The mining operation would make the land uninhabitable for the duration of the extraction, which could be years. The blow was devastating, but somehow not surprising. She'd sensed from the beginning that the forces arrayed against her were too powerful and too determined for her small act of defiance to ultimately succeed. But knowing the truth was different from accepting it, and acceptance was something she wasn't ready to consider. So your choice isn't really between financial ruin and betraying your father's principles, she said. It's between financial ruin and participating in my destruction. Asterisk, that's how I see it, yes. And you chose to help me build the barn anyway. I chose to help you build the barn because it was the right thing to do, regardless of the consequences. My father would have done the same thing, even knowing it was ultimately futile. Especially knowing it was ultimately futile, Mrs. Harper. My family owes yours a debt that can't be repaid with money. Your husband saved my parents when they needed it most, and you've reminded me what it means to fight for something you believe in. If I can't prevent what's coming, at least I can. Make sure you don't face it alone." Rosalie turned from the window to face him, seeing in his weathered features the same stubborn determination that had driven her to attempt an impossible task. But she also saw something else, the weight of inherited obligations and the cost of trying to honor competing loyalties. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now Consolidated exercises their legal options. The mineral survey they threatened isn't just about confirming what they already know. It's about establishing the legal framework for extraction operations. Once they have that, they can claim eminent domain authority and force the sale of your surface rights for fair market value, which they'll determine, which they'll influence, yes. And Mrs. Harper, there's something else you need to know. My investment in Consolidated isn't just financial. I'm listed as a local partner in their development plans, which means my reputation and connections in the community are part of what they're buying. The implications were staggering. People trust you. If you endorse their operations, then resistance becomes much more difficult. Yes, and if you don't endorse them, then they'll likely move against my holdings as well, using some of the same legal mechanisms they're applying to the smaller homesteaders. I'd lose everything, but it wouldn't save your property or anyone else's." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of impossible choices settling between them like a tangible presence. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them both of the storm Wes had predicted. But the weather seemed insignificant compared to the larger forces gathering against their small community. "There is one other option," Wes said finally, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it. "What option?" "The mineral rights contract my father signed with Thomas included a clause that's probably standard legal language, but might be more important than anyone realized at the time. It specifies that the rights can only be exercised with the consent of the surface property owner. Thomas consented by not objecting. Thomas never formally responded, which means the legal status is ambiguous. If you actively refuse consent for mineral extraction, Consolidated would have to challenge that refusal in territorial court. It would take time, cost them money, and give us an opportunity to build political opposition to their plans. And the chances of winning such a challenge, small, but not non-existent. And Mrs. Harper, sometimes fighting a battle you can't win is still the right thing to do." She studied the documents again, seeing them now not just as historical records, but as weapons in a battle she'd never asked to join. "What would refusing consent cost you?" "Everything I have, probably. Consolidated would consider it breach of contract and betrayal of their trust. They'd come after the ranch with everything they have. And you'd do that? Give up your family's legacy to help me fight a battle we'll probably lose? Mrs. Harper, what's the point of preserving a legacy that's built on destroying other people's dreams? My grandfather didn't fight to build an empire so that his grandson could help powerful companies crush the kind of people he started as. The storm struck that evening with the fury Wes had predicted, but they were ready for it. The barn's roof was secure, its walls braced against the wind, and the three of them, Rosalie, Wes, and Martha, who had refused to leave despite the weather, waited out the worst of it in the cabin. As the wind howled around them and snow piled against the windows, they planned their next moves in the battle that would determine not just the fate of one small homestead, but the character of their entire community. The land deed documents remained spread across the kitchen table, the revelations having changed everything and nothing. The barn was still built, the storm was still raging, and the choice between surrender and defiance still lay before them. But now they faced that choice with full knowledge of what it would cost and what it might accomplish. And sometimes Rosalie reflected as she listened to the wind test the strength of Thomas's construction. Knowing the true price of a decision was all the courage you needed to make it. The completed barn walls stood like cathedral pillars against the white expanse of snow, their dark timber weathered but unbowed by the storm that had raged for 3 days and finally exhausted itself. In the pale dawn light, Rosalie emerged from the cabin to survey what remained of her world, her breath forming clouds in air so cold it seemed to crystallize the moment it left her lungs. Everything was transformed, a familiar landscape buried under drifts that reached nearly to the barn's eaves, the fence lines erased, the very boundaries of her property rendered invisible by nature's overwhelming presence. But the barn had held. Thomas's careful joinery and her stubborn construction had withstood winds that had felled trees and torn roofs from less carefully built structures throughout the valley. Standing there in the doorway, one hand resting on her swollen belly, where the baby moved restlessly as if sensing the tension in the air, Rosalie felt a surge of satisfaction that was both personal and profound. Whatever came next, she had accomplished what everyone said was impossible. She had built something that would endure. The satisfaction was tempered by exhaustion that went deeper than mere physical weariness. The final push to complete the barn, before the storm had demanded everything she had to give, and more than she'd known she possessed. Working alongside Wes and Martha, racing against the approaching weather, she'd driven herself past the point of prudence for a woman in her condition. Now, as the immediate crisis had passed, her body was demanding payment for those exertions. Her back ached with a persistent, grinding pain that made every movement an effort of will. The baby's position had shifted lower, creating pressure and discomfort that the doctor in town would probably consider warning signs, if she were brave enough to make the journey for an examination. But with several feet of snow blocking the roads and more weather threatening, such medical luxuries were beyond reach. She would have to trust her body's wisdom and hope that determination could substitute for professional care. Wes appeared around the corner of the barn, leading his horse through snow that reached nearly to the animal's belly. He'd spent the storm in the cabin's small lean-to, sharing the space with her 3 cattle and refusing her offers to make room for him inside the main building. The arrangement had preserved proprieties while keeping them all alive, but it had also reminded her of how precarious their entire situation remained. "Roads are impassable," he reported, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around his face against the cold. "Could be days before anyone can get through from town." "How are the cattle?" "Cold but alive." The barn made all the difference. They would never have survived the storm in that old lean-to. The confirmation filled her with quiet pride. Thomas's vision had been vindicated, her struggle justified by the simple fact that her livestock had lived through weather that would have killed them without proper shelter. It was a small victory, but in circumstances where victory of any kind seemed impossible, small triumphs took on outsized importance. Martha emerged from the barn where she'd been checking on the animals, her face flushed with cold but brightened by something approaching optimism. "Rose, you need to see this." Inside the barn, the 3 cattle stood in comfortable stalls that Thomas had designed but never had the chance to build. The space was warm compared to the bitter air outside, insulated by the animals' body heat and protected from drafts by careful construction. But what had caught Martha's attention was evidence that the barn was already serving purposes beyond simple shelter. "Look at the hay," Martha said, pointing to the loft where they'd stored the precious winter feed. "Dry as summer, even with all that wind and snow. And see how the roof handled the load?" The barn structure had proven itself under the weight of accumulated snow and the stress of hurricane-force winds. Every joint Thomas had specified, every brace Rosalie had installed, every decision they'd made in favor of strength over speed had been validated by the storm's test. The building would serve not just this winter, but many winters to come, a testament to the enduring value of work done correctly. But even as they celebrated the barn's success, the larger battle for the property's future was intensifying. Through the storm, riders had appeared periodically at the edge of visible range, dark figures on horseback who maintained surveillance even in weather that should have made travel impossible. The watchers never approached close enough for identification, but their presence served as a constant reminder that Consolidated Land Company was waiting for the storm to pass before resuming their pressure. They're planning something, Wes said as he joined them in the barn's warmth. Companies don't maintain surveillance in weather like this unless they're preparing for immediate action. What kind of action? Rosalie asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Legal action, most likely. The mineral survey they threatened, probably accompanied by territorial authorities, to ensure cooperation. Once they establish their right to access the property for geological assessment, the rest follows almost automatically. How long do we have? Days, not weeks. The storm bought us time, but it also isolated us from potential support. When they move, we'll be on our own. The knowledge should have been terrifying, but Rosalie found herself oddly calm as she contemplated the approaching confrontation. Perhaps it was the satisfaction of having completed the barn against impossible odds, or perhaps it was simply the clarity that came with understanding exactly what she faced. Either way, the fear that had haunted her since Thomas's death had been replaced by a steely determination to make her stand on ground of her own choosing. "Then we need to be ready," she said simply. They spent the rest of the day preparing for what would likely be the final battle for the homestead's independence. Wes rode to the nearest neighbors who could be reached through the snow, carrying word of what was coming and asking for whatever support the community could provide. Martha inventoried their supplies and prepared the cabin for what might be an extended siege. And Rosalie, despite her growing physical discomfort, used the time to study every legal document in Thomas's papers, searching for anything that might provide leverage in the coming confrontation. What she found was both encouraging and sobering. Thomas had been more careful about legal matters than she'd realized, maintaining meticulous records of every transaction, every improvement to the property, every communication with territorial authorities. The documentation would strengthen their position in any court challenge, but it also revealed the extent to which their small homestead was surrounded by larger interests with competing claims. The mineral rights issue was even more complex than Wes had initially explained. While the Calder family retained underground rights, those rights were subject to territorial regulations that required environmental impact assessments and community consultation before major extraction could begin. Consolidating those requirements with Thomas's carefully documented surface improvements might provide enough legal complexity to delay Consolidated's plans significantly. But delay was different from victory, and Rosalie understood that their best hope was to make the legal challenge so expensive and time-consuming that the company would choose to pursue easier targets. It was a strategy born of desperation rather than strength, but desperate strategies sometimes succeeded when conventional approaches failed. That evening, as they shared a simple meal in the cabin's warmth, Dr. Matthews arrived unexpectedly. Having made the dangerous journey from town on snowshoes when the roads proved impassable for his wagon, his appearance brought both relief and concern relief that medical help was available if needed, concern about what had motivated him to risk such a difficult journey. "Mrs. Harper," he said after examining her by lamplight, "you're in better condition than I expected, given the reports I've been hearing about your activities. But this baby could come at any time, and when it does, you'll need more help than these circumstances can provide. What do you recommend?" "Ideally, you'd come to town where I have proper facilities and assistance. But with the roads blocked and more weather threatening, that's not practical. The next best option is to have someone with midwifery experience stay with you until the birth." "Sarah Chun?" Martha suggested. "If she can get here, yes. I'll send word when I return to town, but you shouldn't count on outside help. Mrs. Harper, you need to prepare for the possibility that this baby will be born here. In these conditions, with only the assistance we can improvise." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders moving carefully through the snow, but with obvious purpose. Through the cabin's small window, they could see lanterns bobbing in the darkness, too many for a casual visit and too organized for coincidence. "They couldn't wait," Wes said grimly, reaching for his coat. "Whatever they're planning, they're doing it tonight." The riders proved to be a mixed group: territorial officials, Consolidated representatives, and local men who'd been hired to provide muscle if needed. James Morrison led the group, his pale face flushed with cold, but his manner suggesting satisfaction rather than discomfort. Behind him rode Edwin Pierce, the nervous territorial agent, and several men Rosalie didn't recognize, but who carried themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to enforcing other people's decisions. "Mrs. Harper," Morrison called from beyond the reach of the cabin's lamplight, We've come to serve you with legal notice of territorial mineral survey rights. You're required to provide access to your property for geological assessment, as specified under Territorial Statute 47B. In the middle of a blizzard? Martha's voice carried clearly across the snow. That's either the most urgent geology work in territorial history or the most obvious harassment. The timing is unfortunate, but the legal requirements are clear. Mrs. Harper, will you accept service of these documents voluntarily, or do we need to proceed under territorial authority? Rosalie stepped into the doorway, her figure silhouetted against the cabin's warm light, one hand resting on her swollen belly, and the other holding the land deed documents she'd been studying. Mr. Morrison, you're welcome to serve whatever papers you have, but you're not welcome on my property tonight. Mrs. Harper, territorial law supersedes property rights in matters of mineral assessment. We have the authority to proceed with or without your cooperation. Then proceed. But understand that any damage to my property, my livestock, or my buildings will be documented and pursued through every legal channel available. Mrs. Harper, Pierce's nervous voice added, we're not here to cause damage. We simply need to establish survey markers and take soil samples. In 3 feet of snow, in sub-zero temperatures, in the middle of the night. Forgive me if I question the scientific necessity of such urgent fieldwork. Wes stepped out of the barn, moving slowly through the snow with his hands visible, but his posture suggesting readiness for trouble. Morrison, this is harassment, pure and simple. Whatever legal authority you think you have, exercising it under. These conditions will look like exactly what it is: intimidation of a pregnant woman in distress. Mr. Calder, your presence here is ... interesting. I trust you understand the implications of interfering with legitimate territorial business. I understand that there's nothing legitimate about what you're doing here tonight. The standoff continued. For several tense minutes, the two groups facing each other across the snow-covered yard, while the barn stood silent witness to the confrontation. Finally, Morrison seemed to reach some internal decision. Very well, Mrs. Harper. We'll postpone the survey until conditions improve. But understand that this is a courtesy, not a concession. We'll be back within 48 hours to complete our work. As the riders disappeared into the darkness, Rosalie felt the baby shift inside her with an urgency that made her gasp. Confrontation had triggered something, whether labor pains or simply the child's response to her elevated stress. She couldn't tell. But the timing, coming so close to the final battle for her property, seemed like one more challenge in a situation that was already testing every limit she possessed. Rose? Martha's voice was sharp with concern. What is it? I think, Rosalie said carefully, one hand pressed to her side, we'd better send for Sarah Chun, whether the baby's ready or not. I don't think we have much choice about timing anymore. The completed barn walls stood strong in the darkness, sheltering the livestock that had survived because of her determination to finish what Thomas started. But now, as the final confrontation approached and new life stirred within her, Rosalie understood that the barn had been more than just a building project. It had been preparation for this moment, when everything she valued would be tested by forces beyond her control, and her only weapons would be the strength she discovered in herself, and the courage of those who chose to stand with her. Tomorrow would bring the battle she'd been preparing for since the first stake was driven into the frozen ground. Tonight, she would rest in the shelter she'd built with her own hands and trust that the foundation Thomas had laid in wood and stone and love would prove strong enough to support whatever came next. The blizzard lantern swayed on its hook. In the barn, casting dancing shadows across the walls as another gust of wind tested the strength of Thomas's construction. Outside, the storm that had been building all day finally unleashed its full fury, driving snow horizontally across the prairie with a violence that made the previous storm seem gentle by comparison. But inside the barn, surrounded by the warm bulk of cattle and the solid presence of hand-fitted timbers, Rosalie found an unexpected peace as the first unmistakable labor pain gripped her body. That was real, she said quietly, her hands pressed against her belly as the contraction subsided. Martha, who had been checking on the animals, turned sharply at the words. How real? Real enough that we're not waiting for Dr. Matthews or Sarah Chun. Rosalie straightened slowly, testing her body's response to movement. Real enough that this baby's coming tonight, storm or no storm. The timing seemed impossible. A cruel joke played by fate on a woman who'd already faced more challenges than any person should bear. But as another contraction built, stronger and more insistent than the first, Rosalie felt a strange calm settle over her. She'd built a barn through an impossible winter, defended her property against forces with unlimited resources, and discovered reserves of strength she'd never known she possessed. Surely she could manage one more impossible task. Martha moved with the swift efficiency of a woman who delivered babies before, though not often and never under such circumstances. We need to get you to the cabin. The barn's warm, but it's no place for birthing. No, the word came out more forcefully than Rosalie had intended. The cabin's too far from help if something goes wrong. If Wes needs to ride for assistance, ... Rose, you can't have a baby in a barn. Women have been having babies in barns since the beginning of time. At least this one has clean straw and walls that won't let the wind through. Before Martha could argue further, the barn door burst open and Wes stumbled in, his coat white, with snow in his face, grim with news that seemed to pale in importance when he saw Rosalie's condition. "They're coming back," he said breathlessly. "Morrison and at least a dozen men fighting through the storm. They'll be here within the hour." "No?" Martha's voice rose in disbelief. "In this weather? Are they insane? They're desperate. And they're not letting weather stop them this time." Another contraction seized Rosalie, stronger than the others and lasting long enough to make speech impossible. When it passed, she found both her companions staring at her with the dawning realization that multiple crises were converging on this single night. "How long?" Wes asked simply. "Hours, maybe. First babies usually take their time, but ... Rosalie gasped as another pain began building almost immediately after the previous one had ended. "But this one seems to be in a hurry. Rose, listen to me." Martha's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions. "We can't fight a legal battle and deliver a baby at the same time. You need to choose what's most important." "I can't choose. The baby's coming whether I'm ready or not, and Morrison's coming whether we want him or not. Then we deal with both," Wes said with the flat certainty of a man who'd made his decision. "Martha, what do you need for the birth?" "Clean linens, hot water, and privacy, and preferably a doctor, but we're not getting that tonight. You'll have everything else. I'll handle Morrison and his men. Wes, there are at least a dozen of them, and they're fighting a blizzard to get here, which means they're cold, tired, and probably making mistakes. Sometimes that's enough to even the odds." The conversation was interrupted by Rosalie's sharp intake of breath as the strongest contraction yet gripped her body. This time, the pain was accompanied by a sensation of pressure and movement that left no doubt about what was happening. "Martha," she gasped, "I think we're past the point of planning." The next hour unfolded like a fever dream, reality fractured by pain and adrenaline, and the surreal juxtaposition of new life emerging, while forces gathered outside to destroy everything she'd built. Martha had transformed one corner of the barn into an impromptu birthing area, using horse blankets and clean straw to create a space that was as comfortable as circumstances allowed. The lantern provided just enough light to work by, its steady glow a small defiance against the chaos raging beyond the barn walls. Wes had positioned himself near the barn door, his rifle ready and his attention divided between watching for Morrison's approach and monitoring Rosalie's condition. The strain of managing both responsibilities showed in his face, but his presence provided a steady influence that kept panic at bay. "They're here," he announced quietly as the sound of horses became audible over the storm's howling. "Staying back for now, probably waiting for the worst of the wind to die down." "How many?" Martha asked without looking up from her ministrations. Hard to tell in this weather. At least 10, maybe more. Another contraction seized Rosalie, and this time she felt the unmistakable urge to push. "Martha, something's happening." "No, dear, you're doing fine. Just breathe through it and let your body do what it knows how to do." The advice was easier to give than follow, especially when the barn door rattled under the impact of wind-driven snow and the knowledge that armed men waited outside. But as the contraction peaked, Rosalie found herself drawing on the same determination that had driven her to complete an impossible construction project. If she could build a barn through winter, she could certainly deliver a baby through a blizzard. Mrs. Harper. Morrison's voice cut through the storm, amplified by some kind of speaking horn. We know you're in there. Open the door, and this can all be resolved peacefully. Wes positioned himself beside the door, his rifle ready but not yet visible to anyone outside. What's your authority for being here, Morrison? Territorial warrant. For mineral survey and assessment. Mrs. Harper is required by law to provide access. In the middle of a blizzard? At night? That's not law enforcement. That's harassment. Mr. Calder, your interference with territorial business is noted and will be reported. Stand aside. The exchange was interrupted by Rosalie's sharp cry as another contraction peaked. This time, she could feel the baby moving, responding to forces beyond anyone's control. Whatever was going to happen outside would have to wait for nature to complete its ancient work. I can see the head, Martha announced with quiet excitement. Rose, with the next contraction, I need you to push as hard as you can. The timing seemed impossibly wrong. Morrison and his men gathering outside while she lay vulnerable and exposed in the straw. But the baby's arrival would not be delayed by legal battles or territorial politics. As the next contraction built, Rosalie summoned every ounce of strength she possessed and pushed with the desperate intensity of a woman fighting for two lives. That's it, Martha's voice carried genuine joy. The head's out. One more like that, and we'll have your baby. But even as new life struggled to enter the world, the confrontation outside was escalating. The barn door shook under heavy impacts, not wind this time, but human force applied with deliberate intent. Mrs. Harper. Morrison's voice was closer, now suggesting he'd move to within a few feet of the door. You have 30 seconds to open this door voluntarily, or we'll open it for you. She's having a baby, Wes shouted back. Have you lost your minds completely? We have our orders, Mr. Calder. Stand aside. The door burst open in a shower of snow and wind, revealing Morrison and 3 other men silhouetted against the storm. They'd clearly expected to find Rosalie in the cabin, not in the barn, and the sight of her in active labor stopped them in their tracks. Jesus, one of them breathed. Morrison, we have our orders, Morrison repeated, but his voice carried less certainty than before. Mrs. Harper, territorial law requires. His words were cut off by Rosalie's final, desperate push as her body completed the work it had begun. Martha's hands moved with practiced skill, guiding the baby's shoulders and then catching the tiny, slippery form as it emerged into the world. For a moment, the barn was absolutely silent except for the storm's howling. Then, cutting through the wind and tension and impossible circumstances, came a sound that changed everything. The thin, indignant cry of a newborn taking its first breath. It's a girl, Martha announced softly, her voice filled with wonder at the miracle she'd just witnessed. Rosalie, you have a daughter. Asterisk. The baby's cry seemed to break the spell that had frozen everyone in place. Morrison and his men stood in the doorway, snow swirling around them, staring at a scene that made their legal documents and territorial authority seem suddenly irrelevant. Wes lowered his rifle, his face showing the same awe that gripped everyone. Present. And Rosalie, exhausted but triumphant, reached out trembling arms to receive the child she'd carried through winter and hardship and impossible dreams in that moment. As the blizzard lantern cast its warm light over mother and child, the barn Thomas had designed became something more than shelter. It became a sanctuary where new life had entered the world despite every force arrayed against it, and where the simple fact of birth had transformed a confrontation into something approaching reverence. But the storm still raged outside, and the men who'd come to destroy her life still stood in the doorway. The baby's arrival had changed everything and nothing, bringing new joy, but also new vulnerability. As Rosalie held her daughter close, feeling the child's warmth against her chest, she understood that the real battle was just beginning. The newborns. First cry cut through the barn like a church bell, announcing salvation. Its thin but determined voice, silencing even the storms howling for a moment that stretched into eternity. Morrison and his men stood frozen in the doorway, their legal documents and territorial authority rendered suddenly meaningless by the simple fact of new life entering the world. Even the hardest among them seemed to recognize that they had stumbled into something sacred, a moment that demanded reverence rather than enforcement. Rosalie cradled her daughter against her chest, feeling the child's warmth and surprising strength as tiny fists waved in protest at the cold world she'd entered. The baby was perfect 10 fingers, 10 toes, lungs that worked with impressive volume, and eyes that seemed to take in everything with the startled awareness of someone who'd arrived earlier than expected, but was determined to make the best of it. "She's beautiful," Martha whispered, her skilled hands continuing the work of ensuring both mother and child were safe. "And strong. Listen to those lungs." Wes had moved closer, his rifle forgotten, as he stared at the baby with the expression of a man witnessing a miracle. "What will you name her?" "Hope," Rosalie said without hesitation, the name emerging from some deep certainty she hadn't known she possessed. "Her name is Hope." The choice seemed to galvanize Morrison, who stepped forward despite the incongruity of his position. "Mrs. Harper, I understand this is an emotional moment, but my authority doesn't change because of personal circumstances. I still have legal obligations to fulfill." "Your legal obligations," Martha said with ice in her voice, "can wait until this woman has recovered from childbirth." What kind of man serves legal papers on a mother who's just given birth? The kind who has orders from territorial headquarters and a job to protect. Orders can be delayed. Jobs can be changed. But basic human decency is something you either have or you don't. One of Morrison's companions, a younger man who'd been staring at the scene with obvious discomfort, stepped forward. "Mr. Morrison, maybe we should do what we came here to do." Morrison cut him off. "Mrs. Harper, I'm placing these documents here where you can see them." He set a leather portfolio on a nearby hay bale. "They grant us authority to conduct mineral surveys on this property, starting immediately." "Immediately?" Wes's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Look around you, Morrison. Does this look like the time for geological surveys? The timing is unfortunate, but the law doesn't recognize personal convenience as grounds for delay. The law also doesn't recognize harassment and endangerment as legitimate enforcement techniques." The argument was interrupted by a commotion outside, the sound of multiple horses approaching through the storm, their riders calling out in voices that carried relief rather than aggression. Through the barn door came Dr. Matthews, followed by Sarah Chun and 3 other figures bundled so heavily against the cold that they were barely recognizable as human. "Thank God," Dr. Matthews breathed, taking in the scene with professional assessment. "Mrs. Harper, how are you feeling?" "Tired but well," Rosalie replied, reluctant to release her hold on baby Hope even for medical examination. She came fast. First babies usually don't, but this one apparently had her own schedule. He moved closer, his experienced hands gentle, as he checked both mother and child. "You did excellent work, Martha. Everything looks good." Sarah Chun had been studying the presence of Morrison and his men with obvious displeasure. What exactly is going on here? Why are there armed men in a barn where a woman just gave birth? "Territorial business," Morrison replied stiffly. "We have authority. You have authority to terrorize new mothers?" Sarah's voice carried the kind of quiet fury that was more frightening than shouting. "Doctor, is this woman in any condition to deal with legal proceedings?" "Absolutely not. She needs rest, warmth, and quiet. Any stress could be dangerous for both mother and child." "Then I suggest," Sarah continued, her attention returning to Morrison, "that you and your men leave immediately and return when Mrs. Harper has recovered from childbirth." "I'm afraid that's not possible. We have a schedule to maintain." "Then maintain it somewhere else." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by another arrival, this one unexpected and potentially game-changing. Through the storm came the sound of a large group of riders, their approach announced by shouted greetings and the jingling of harness. As they drew closer, it became clear that this wasn't another official delegation, but something far more significant. The neighbors. Eric Johansson appeared first, his weathered face grim with purpose as he surveyed the scene in the barn. Behind him came a dozen other men and women from the surrounding homesteads, all of whom had made the dangerous journey through the blizzard to be here for reasons that had nothing to do with territorial law or mineral rights. Heard there was trouble, Eric announced simply. Figured you might need some support. How did you know? Rosalie asked. Young Billy Patterson. That boy can track a whisper through a thunderstorm, and he's been watching the consolidated camp for days. When he saw them heading out in this weather, he knew it wasn't for anything good. Martha smiled with fierce satisfaction. And you all came out in this storm? Rose Harper's been fighting this battle alone long enough, said Anna Johansson, Eric's wife. Time the rest of us remembered what neighbors are for. Morrison's expression had grown increasingly grim as more settlers appeared in the barn's entrance. What had been a manageable confrontation with an isolated woman was rapidly becoming something much more complicated. A dozen homesteaders, all of them voters in territorial elections, all of them potential sources of political pressure, changed the calculus of enforcement significantly. This is still territorial business, he said, but his voice carried less conviction than before. This is community business, Eric replied. Has been since you started pressuring folks to sell out to your company. Maybe it's time we had a conversation about that. The mineral survey is legally authorized. In the middle of a blizzard, on the night a woman gives birth. Anna Johansson's voice carried the moral authority of someone who'd raised 6 children and buried 2. Mr. Morrison, I've known you since you were a boy causing trouble in Sunday school. Your mother would be ashamed of what you've become. The personal attack seemed to hit harder than any legal argument. Morrison's face flushed, but he maintained his official bearing. Mrs. Johansson, my personal history doesn't change my professional obligations. Maybe not, but it should change your perspective on what those obligations actually require. Dr. Matthews stepped forward, his medical authority providing a different kind of leverage. Gentlemen, from a medical standpoint, I must insist that Mrs. Harper be allowed to rest. Any attempt to conduct business in these circumstances would be not just inappropriate, but potentially dangerous. Asterisk, Doctor, I respect your medical opinion, but no buts, Morrison. The voice belonged to Judge William Hartley, the territorial magistrate, who'd apparently been among the group of arriving neighbors. Dr. Matthews is correct that medical necessity supersedes bureaucratic scheduling. Mrs. Harper will not be required to participate in any legal proceedings for at least 72 hours. Morrison's face showed his recognition that the situation had moved beyond his control. The presence of a territorial judge, supported by a dozen voters and backed by medical authority, made continuation of his enforcement action legally and politically impossible. Judge Hartley, I wasn't aware you were in the area. I wasn't, until I received word that territorial agents were planning night enforcement actions against citizens in medical distress. Such actions reflect poorly on territorial governance and require immediate judicial oversight. We were simply executing lawful orders, which can be executed at a more appropriate time and under more appropriate circumstances. The judge's tone brooked no argument. Mr. Morrison, you and your men will leave this property immediately and not return until Mrs. Harper has recovered from childbirth and can participate meaningfully in any legal proceedings. Sir, my orders come from territorial headquarters, and my authority comes from the territorial constitution, which supersedes administrative orders when citizen rights are at stake. You will leave now. As Morrison and his men retreated into the storm, muttering among themselves about political interference and bureaucratic complications, the barn settled into the warm quiet of community solidarity. Baby Hope had slept through most of the confrontation, apparently trusting that the adults would sort out their complicated affairs while she focused on the more immediate business of being born. Asterisk. She's perfect, Sarah Chun observed, her midwife's trained eye noting the baby's healthy color and strong movements. And she came into the world surrounded by people who'll fight for her future. That's not a bad beginning. Rosalie looked around the barn at the faces of neighbors who'd risked the storm to stand with her, at the man who'd sacrificed his own interest to help her build something lasting, at the woman who delivered her child with skill and love. The barn Thomas had designed had become more than shelter. It had become the center of a community that chose to defend its own against forces that would reduce everything to profit and loss. "Thank you," she said simply, the words encompassing more gratitude than any speech could contain. "All of you. For everything." "No need for thanks," Eric replied. "This is what neighbors do. What they've always done, and what they'll keep doing as long as there are folks worth standing up for." Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, its fury spent against the barns. Solid walls and the even more solid determination of people who refused to surrender their dreams to easier circumstances. Inside, baby Hope stirred in her mother's arms, her tiny voice adding a new note to the conversation of adults who discovered that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. The barn had held against the storm. A community had held against the pressure. And in the warm circle of lamplight, surrounded by the proof of what could be accomplished when ordinary people refused to accept defeat, Rosalie Harper held her daughter close and felt the future opening before them like spring after the hardest winter. The barn door plaque caught the morning sunlight, its simple wooden surface bearing the carved words, "Harper Farm, founded 1880, completed 1883, in letters that would weather many seasons, but never fade in meaning. Rosalie traced the carved letters with her finger, baby Hope sleeping peacefully in the crook of her other arm, both of them warmed by spring sunshine that felt like benediction after the hardest winter any of them could remember. 3 months had passed since that storm-torn night when Hope entered the world surrounded by legal battles and community solidarity. 3 months of legal maneuvering, political pressure, and gradual victory that had surprised everyone except those who'd witnessed. Rosalie Harper's determination to finish what couldn't be finished and build what couldn't be built. The territorial court had ultimately ruled in their favor, finding that Consolidated Land Company's enforcement actions violated both territorial law and basic standards of human decency. Judge Hartley's detailed opinion had become required reading in the territorial capital, a blistering condemnation of corporate overreach disguised as legal procedure. More importantly, the ruling had established precedents that protected other homesteaders from similar pressure, turning Rosalie's individual struggle into a broader victory for the rights of ordinary citizens. The mineral rights question had been resolved through negotiation rather than litigation, with Wes Calder formally transferring his family's underground claims to Rosalie in exchange for a partnership arrangement that would ensure any future mining operations respected both the land and the people who lived on it. It was a solution that honored his father's principles while freeing him from obligations that had compromised his conscience. But the legal victories, satisfying as they were, mattered less than the personal transformations that had emerged from the struggle. The barn had become more than agricultural infrastructure. It had become a symbol of what ordinary people could accomplish when they refused to accept defeat. Visitors came regularly now, some to see the structure itself, others to meet the woman who'd built it under impossible circumstances, all of them drawn by a story that reminded them of possibilities they'd almost forgotten. "She's growing fast," Martha observed, approaching with a basket of fresh eggs and the satisfied expression of someone whose faith in human nature had been thoroughly vindicated. "And she's got her mother's stubborn streak." "Is that what we're calling it?" Rosalie smiled, adjusting Hope's position as the baby stirred. "I prefer to think of it as determination. Call it whatever you like, but that child's going to be a force to reckon with, just like her mother." They stood together in the doorway of the barn, looking out over the valley, where spring was painting the prairie in shades of green that seemed impossibly vibrant after months of snow and gray skies. The landscape was dotted with new construction, barns and houses and fence lines that marked the expansion of a community that had discovered its own strength through collective action. "Have you heard from Wes lately?" Martha asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Yesterday. He's in the territorial capital, testifying before the Land Use Committee about mining regulations. Seems our little battle has attracted attention in political circles. Good attention, I hope. The kind that results in actual protection for Homesteaders rather than just pretty speeches about frontier values. Wes thinks they might pass real reform legislation before the year's out. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar wagon, driven by Dr. Matthews and carrying several passengers who climbed down with the careful movements of people unaccustomed to frontier travel. The group included 2 men in expensive suits and a woman whose notebook and pencil identified her as a journalist of some kind. "Mrs. Harper," Dr. Matthews called, "I've brought some folks who'd like to meet you. This is Robert Caldwell from the territorial newspaper, James Morrison's replacement at the land office, and Miss Catherine Wade from Harper's Weekly magazine." Rosalie felt a moment of amused irony at the mention of Harper's Weekly, a publication that had taken particular interest in her story because of the name coincidence. "Welcome to Harper Farm, though I should warn you, we're a working operation, not a tourist attraction." Mrs. Harper, Catherine Wade stepped forward with the confident manner of someone accustomed to interviewing important people. "Our readers are fascinated by your story. A woman building a barn while pregnant, standing. Up to corporate pressure, giving birth during a blizzard. It has all the elements of frontier legend. It has all the elements of necessity. I needed shelter for my livestock. My neighbors needed someone to take a stand, and my baby needed to be born regardless of the weather. But surely you understand the symbolic importance of what you accomplished. You've become an inspiration to women across the territory." Rosalie considered the question while Hope made small sounds of waking interest. "I hope I've become an inspiration to anyone who's ever been told they can't do something that needs doing. Gender's less important than determination." The replacement land agent, a nervous young man who seemed determined to distance himself from his predecessor's methods, stepped forward with obvious discomfort. "Mrs. Harper, I want to personally apologize for the actions taken against you. The Territorial Land Office has implemented new policies to ensure such harassment never happens again. I appreciate that, but the real test will be how you handle the next homesteader who refuses to sell to powerful interests. Ma'am, our new guidelines require that all enforcement actions be reviewed by territorial judges before implementation. No more night raids, no more pressure tactics during personal emergencies." Good, though it's sad that common decency had to be written into official policy. As the visitors toured the barn and interviewed neighbors about the winter's events, Rosalie found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The structure around her bore little resemblance to the impossible dream she'd conceived on that cold morning when desperation had finally overcome prudence. Every joint, every board, every carefully fitted piece told a story of determination triumphing over circumstance. But more than that, the barn had become the center of a community that had discovered its own strength through collective action. The weekly gatherings that had started as informal mutual aid sessions had evolved into a formal homesteaders' association with political influence that extended far beyond their small valley. What had begun as one woman's stubborn refusal to surrender had become a movement that was changing how territories treated their citizens. Wes arrived that evening, his horse steaming from a hard ride, and his face showing the satisfaction of someone who'd accomplished something worthwhile in the territorial capital. He swung down from the saddle with practiced ease, his movements showing none of the conflict and uncertainty that had marked his earlier visits. "The mining regulation bill passed," he announced without preamble. "Full environmental review required for any operation larger than 10 acres. Community input mandated for all territorial mineral claims, and compensation requirements that actually protect property owners." "That's wonderful," Rosalie said, meaning it. "How long before it takes effect?" "Immediately for new claims. 5 years for existing operations to comply. It won't stop all corporate overreach, but it'll make the kind of pressure you faced much more difficult. And much more expensive," Martha added with satisfaction. "Nothing changes corporate behavior faster than increased costs." They shared. Dinner in the cabin, the conversation ranging over the changes that had swept through their community since winter's end. The Andersons had returned from California, using their consolidated buyout money to purchase better land closer to town. 3 new families had claimed homesteads in the valley, drawn by stories of community solidarity and successful resistance to corporate pressure. Most importantly, The territorial government had established a homesteader advocacy office, staffed by people who understood frontier realities rather than distant bureaucrats. As evening settled over the valley, Rosalie found herself standing once again in the barn doorway, hope sleeping in her arms and the completed structure rising around her like a cathedral built to honor simple virtues. The plaque beside the door marked not just the completion of a building project, but the transformation of a community and the discovery of what ordinary people could accomplish when they refused to accept defeat. No regrets? Wes asked, joining her in the doorway. About which part? Building an impossible barn, fighting a legal battle I couldn't win, or giving birth during a blizzard. About any of it. All of it. Rosalie looked out over the valley, where lights were beginning to twinkle in cabin windows, each one representing a family that had chosen to stay and fight rather than surrender their dreams to easier circumstances. How can I regret something? That taught me who I really am. And who are you, really? Someone who finishes what she starts. Someone who builds things to last. Someone who believes that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have to. Thomas would be proud. Thomas would probably say I took unnecessary risks and should have asked for help sooner. Rosalie smiled at the memory of her husband's practical nature. But yes, I think he'd be proud that his barn finally got built. It's more than his barn now. Yes, it is. It's proof that impossible things become possible when enough people decide they're worth doing. The barn door plaque gleamed in the last light of day, its simple message carrying weight that would only grow with time. Future generations would read those carved words and wonder about the woman who'd built something lasting in the face of impossible odds, who'd discovered that determination could triumph over circumstance and that community could overcome any force arrayed against it. But tonight, standing in the doorway of the barn she'd built with her own hands, holding the daughter who'd entered the world surrounded by courage and solidarity, Rosalie Harper felt only the quiet satisfaction of work completed and challenges met. The impossible had become inevitable. The barn had become a symbol, and the woman who'd been told she couldn't build anything lasting had created something that would endure long after the forces that opposed her were forgotten. In the distance, spring thunder rumbled across the prairie, promising the rains that would green the valley and nourish the dreams that had taken root in this harsh but generous land. And in the barn that had sheltered them through winter's worst storms, the sound of gentle breathing marked the peace that comes to those who discover that the impossible is just another word for something that hasn't been done, yet by someone stubborn enough to try.